Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to see if we might get started. Thank you all so much for coming today to this town hall meeting on budget. The way the program will run, just to give everyone a sense of perspective. First, I'm going to take everyone through the information, the financial information associated with the budget reductions as we now come to understand them, since the governor signed the budget a couple of days ago, and we have a pretty good understanding of its impacts for Sonoma State University. Then I'm going to turn to Dr. Ochoa, Eduardo Ochoa, our Chief Academic Officer and our Provost, to talk a little bit about the planning that's already underway and some of the implications of the budget to academic affairs particularly. Then Andy Merrifield, Professor Merrifield, who's also a member of our budget committee, an influential leader within the California Faculty Association, is going to reflect a bit on the implications and the outcome of the furlough vote that took place with the California Faculty Association. Then Professor Moulton, Susan Moulton, is going to offer some observations from a faculty perspective as the chair of our faculty. And then Nick is going to offer some reflections as the student leader on the campus during the summer. Our president of our student body is in Washington for the summer, but Nick is the VP for Finance, and he will make some comments as the VP for Finance for the ASI. And then we'll open it to questions to see what questions the group has. So, again, welcome. We'll start with our first slide, which gives the implications of the budget. And in case you haven't been tracking with what the budget implications are for Sonoma State University, the number is about $15 million. And that's the first number you see up here, 15 million, actually closer to 16 million. And to give you some sense, that's about 17% of our base budget. If you will go to the library and look up the expenditure plan for the 8-9 year, the one that we just completed, you would see it's close to $93 million or so. And so what we're being asked to do as a university is to remove $15.8 million from that budget for a fiscal year that began already the 1st of July. So it's an extraordinary number. In all the years that I've been associated with the CSU, I've never seen a number quite like this. It really is quite profound and will have serious implications for nearly every aspect of campus operations. The first strategy comes from the student body. It's a burden that they will absorb, they and their families. It's $5 million. It represents a 30% increase in the state university fee. And this number that you see here, just a little bit over $5 million, is net of the 1/3 set aside for financial aid. But still, I don't want to underestimate or in any way suggest that this number is insignificant. This is a huge change, and for those of you who have tracked higher education, public policy in California over the years, the levels of our state university fees have risen to levels that I think many of us never thought could be possible within the state. But that's the case, and the trustees did act on this, both in the spring meetings of the board and just recently. It does represent a 30% increase, and it is a permanent increase, and it goes to address part of the $15 million, about a third. The next piece that you see here is $6,351,000. That's the impact of the furlough. Some of you were here last week for the CSU and the positions conversation, MPP and confidential. Since that time, since we've last met, the APC has also agreed to furlough, and the California Faculty Association has agreed to furlough. This is the combined estimated total of what we think the furlough will be worth: 24 days for non-faculty employees over 12 months, 20 days for faculty employees over 10 months. And Andy will talk more about the furloughs from the point of view of the CFA. Later on, in fact, right after this, at 1 o'clock today, I, along with our HR team, will be meeting with the APC leadership to talk with them about their plans for furlough and how they might fit with the template we discussed last week with CSU EU. And then we'll do another town hall, primarily for APC folks, but of course everyone's welcome to talk about the outcome of the furloughing planning for APC. And I wouldn't be surprised something similar might happen with CFA once those logistics are worked out. A couple of things about the furlough. The first one, let me come to this SETC impact, SETC RFA's personnel. They have not agreed to furlough, and it's my understanding that they have agreed to layoff. So the value of the furlough for the SCTC we estimate to be about $277,000. And so it's necessary for our campus to go into the SCTC area and remove $277,000 from the employees that are associated with that particular bargaining unit. There's a variety of ways that might happen. Later on this afternoon, I think at 3 o'clock, I'm meeting with folks to talk about whether our own local SCTC people would be interested in voluntary furlough. They may wish to do that. They have that option, and we'll discuss to see if our local SCTC folks are interested in that concept. Otherwise, we'll have to figure out how to reduce SCTC by 277 in order to make our estimate of $6,351,000. The other thing that you see on the sheet here is the impact on utilities, and that might be a little peculiar to have that associated with furlough. But as we discussed last week with folks that were here, one of the things that the campus is seriously hoping that might be able to happen, I don't know in the bag yet, but maybe could happen, is that we could go to sort of a mandatory closure of certain days during the spring semester, say every other Friday or something like that, and perhaps move to a 4-day week, during the summer months. If that happened, we could actually close the campus and everyone will work on those days except for very essential services. We could save about $200,000 in utilities, which is what we're expecting to have to come up with to meet the rising utility costs next year. If we can't do a mandatory closure, we will have to add to this problem $200,000. So that's why the closure issue is there, and there'll be conversations about whether or not it makes sense to go to a mandatory closure on certain days in the spring as well as the summer. So that's why that's there. That leaves us with $4,399,164. You may have heard, and it is a fact, that the Board of Trustees, the CSU Board of Trustees, wishes the Sonoma State University campus to reduce its enrollment from its current budgeted target enrollment of 7,500 FTES down to 7,050 FTES. And we have 2 years to do that, both in the 9-10 year and the 10-11 year. This plan that's before you calls for a decrease in the first year of 9-10 of almost the full amount, 378 FTES. And you'll see later on in the presentation that we would reduce in the following year the remaining 72. So if we go to the next slide, we can talk about how this remaining $4,399,000 would be generated in savings. And it's allocated out through divisions based on marginal cost, because it is associated with enrollment. And the first number you see there, University Affairs, $30,794. Vice President Condon will address this issue with a roll forward fund he was able to save from the 8-9 year. That's how he'll handle the cut for the 9-10 year. By the time we get to 10-11, he will have to make this cut permanent. And he'll do that through either a permanent reduction in operating expense or some other kind of personnel action that may take place. But for the 9-10 year, University Affairs will handle it with one-time funds that they're rolling forward from last year. The same will be true of development. Their number of $52,790 will come from one-time money that they saved from last year, and then they'll have to make that a permanent reduction in 10-11. And the reason why that is you look at University Affairs and you look at development, they have no vacant positions essentially at this time. And because of our agreements with the CSU EU and the confidentials, we're not permitted to get into the layoff situation for the fall semester. And so it's impossible for them to make their reductions in a permanent way during the 9-10 year. I'm going to skip over academic affairs for a minute because Eduardo is going to spend more time with that one particularly. And I'll slide down to student affairs, $394,000. Here, Vice President Phillips has been keeping certain positions vacant within the Division of Student Affairs as that happened during the 8-9 years. So he has a number of positions that have become vacant over the last 12 months, and now he will go forward and eliminate those positions on a permanent basis to help make this reduction. But that's not enough in Matthew's shop. What Matthew will also have to do is reduce operating expense across the units of student affairs by about $130,000 to address the remaining issues within the student affairs division. In my own area of responsibility of administration and finance, like Matthew, we began planning for budget reductions early during 2008. in my area of responsibility, a number of jobs have been vacant, mostly in the management plan, mostly in the MPP, not all, but most. So this $1 million or $1,050,000 that you see here will be reduced on a permanent basis this fiscal year through the reduction in management. And I'll be able to give you in a few weeks the specific positions that we will eliminate and how we will manage to absorb those duties that used to be fulfilled by the people that were incumbents in that area. Let me stop here and go, Eduardo, if you would be kind enough to maybe take us in a general sense to the $2.8 million in academic affairs.
All right. We basically have started with the reduction in instruction that would take place associated with the enrollment reduction of 378 FTEs. And we calculated that that would entail a reduction of about $1.9 million. And that's about, and the instructional budget, let me back up a little bit. For the purposes of this exercise, we carved up the budget for the division into 4 major areas: instruction, chair support, chair and librarian support, staff support, and operating expense budget. And those 4 categories roughly represent each in turn about 67%, 6%, 22%, and 5% of the overall budget. So we started with instruction and applied a reduction there that was calculated to accommodate the reduction in enrollment. And that worked out to about just under a 6% reduction in the base budget for instruction. And we applied then similar percentages of reduction to the remaining 3 areas. So each of them, the reductions for those 4 areas will range between 5.9% and about 6.6%. And that's how it adds up to the $2.8 million total for our division. Basically,
thank you. We'll have time for questions for all of the panels, so I want to get all the financial data out there so everyone has that perspective. Beyond these reductions, there are a number of things that are also problematic and not reflected in the budget planning for the 19-year. Things that have been very important to our campus as part of the mini compact, as we used to call it, or still do call it, associated with our budget planning. The first one is the faculty development augmentation. You remember some years ago, as part of our growth initiative, President Armaniano had made a commitment to add $200,000 a year each year for 5 years to build to a $1 million faculty development fund. We have $200,000 that we were able to achieve, and we had hoped to add to that fund this year. And that is currently not in the plan. So I'm sort of in a suspension mode because we have to meet with projections and we're not growing. Also during the spring semester last year, we had a great deal of very positive discussion, actually before the fall and spring, on diversity initiatives. And we had come forward with a plan, as you recall, in the spring to identify $320,000 from the top, if you will, to help address issues associated with diversity and move the campus forward in that important area. It's very problematic in this particular year to identify exactly how we would do that, as you might expect. And then finally, the GIS lab. This is particularly important to our colleagues in the School of Social Sciences. It's a program that we've had for many, many years. We haven't really ever fully addressed how to fund and finance the GIS lab. Very important instructional and research facility. We need to still figure out those issues. I don't mean to suggest that these things are off the table. I'm just here to say today there's not an official plan yet. President Armaniano has asked his cabinet to meet with him tomorrow in retreat to begin to reflect upon these particular issues and what strategies we can put together to make sure that we make progress in the important area of diversity and that we make progress also with the GIS resolution. But to be honest with you today, I cannot tell you exactly how that will come to pass. On the next slide, you'll see some other issues that are outside the general fund, but are very important to our instructional programs and our administrative operations. The first one relates to the School of Extended Education. And as you know, if you've been following the budget scenarios in the town hall, our School of Extended Education under Dean Merrifield's leadership is in a transition phase as they move to a different mode of operation, moving to more self-support programs, addressing the loss of the summer school and a variety of other challenges that have existed in extended education over the years. We need to provide some bridge financing to keep the School of Extended Education on that firm footing and moving forward. We still need to do that. That's particularly important for the 5 schools in the library who have come to rely on returns from extended education earnings to support their operating expense needs. We've been able to honor that for the 8-9 year. We still are working on how to honor that for the 9-10 year. Eduardo and I are both hopeful that with a variety of changes that are underway, it may be possible that extended education might not need quite as much. And now that Robert Rose, the business officer for the school, I think is nearly back from vacation, will be back relatively soon. Eduardo's back in town from his vacation, and Mark's here. We can sit down with those folks and take a look at the 9-10 budget to see just exactly how we can shore up this need. But at the moment, we don't have a specific plan to do that, but a commitment to try to close that gap. Second, as I reported in our town halls in the past, our endowment, the university's endowment, has not had its best year, like all endowments associated with in the philanthropic world. Most of our portfolio with the Common Fund is underperforming, and the amount of distribution of earnings that we would normally make is not possible during the 9-10 year. This has nothing to do with the Carnelli loan episode that you've read about, I'm sure. And we can spend more time on the Carnelli loan issue, perhaps in another town hall, since there seems to be a lot of interest around the place in that topic. But this particular endowment issue has absolutely nothing to do with that particular story. We still need to find some support that normally would have come from the endowment for such programs as the Program in Native American Studies, the Emerson Engineering Program, the Schultz Endowment in the Library, the Person Endowment, to name a few. And we're working hard to try to figure out how to show up those programs, because there are real people associated with those programs, faculty members, staff that are supported by those initiatives. I'm happy to report, however, that the scholarship program that's supported by the endowment is completely funded for the 9-10 year. So whatever issues were associated with the endowment, our earning problems in that area are not going to have any impact on the student scholarships. Third, athletics. As an NC2A program, I've reported on this one many times over the town hall. As an NC2A Division II program has certain needs that we have yet to address, and we're still working on those issues. And finally, in our self-support areas, where we're at, this is particularly our housing program, our parking program, and our student union recreation center program. These programs are all going to be affected by the reduction in enrollment of 350 students first, and then up to 450 ultimately. And as we have less students living in residence, when it comes to pass, there's less revenue, and debt service coverage ratios become a challenge. So in the next few days, I will be meeting with the folks that manage the recreation center, manage housing, manage residence life, manage parking, to make certain that we maintain the debt service and extended education again, and make certain that we maintain the required debt service coverage ratios associated with university debt. If we go to the next slide, I think it's going to bring me to a preliminary look to the 10-11 year. Well, everyone is really reeling in effect from the 9-10 year. I have to say that the 10-11 year is becoming even more challenging, perhaps, to think about. We know, the first slide you see here, 72 FTES, this is the additional enrollment reduction that I mentioned earlier in my presentation that will bring us down to our new target of 7050. And it's a relatively modest reduction, and the savings associated with that is the $838,000 that we see here. But also in the 10-11 year, from preliminary numbers that we've seen from the Chancellor's Office, is an unallocated reduction of $3.2 million. This is on top of the reductions that I just mentioned to you of $4 million that we're just dealing with in the 9-10 year. We have to come up with another $4 million, 3.2 in unallocated 838 in enrollment reductions in the 10-11 years. So you can imagine the challenge that is going to be to try to figure that out. There are no furloughs built into these numbers in the 10-11 year. Furloughs are assumed to go away during the 10-11 year, and everyone return returns to their normal salary situations, but still we have to find this money. One of the big fears, and Andy might reflect upon this a little bit in his comments, since he's a keen observer of the Sacramento scene and federal level as well, one of the things that this model assumes, this formula assumes, and I want to stress the point, that there's approximately $650 million of money from a federal stimulus package underpinning the CSU budget in 9/10. And this model assumes that that will be replaced in 10/11 in the state of California. You can make your own assumptions if that will or will not happen, and Andy may comment on that. But if it doesn't happen, if the federal stimulus money is not replaced by the state, CSU would lose about $650 million figures. To translate that down to the SSU campus, that's about $15 million more to our campus that we would add to the $4 million, bringing us to a reduction of $19 million in the 10-11 year. Numbers clearly are almost difficult for us to conceive of, particularly in light of the budget reductions that we're taking at this point. That's my numbers. This might be a good opportunity to turn to Andy to see if Andy might reflect on the furlough, and maybe, and if you have a moment, Andy, on the political prospects of the stimulus.
Thanks. Those people who thought that the stimulus package could somehow or another reduce the $583 million cut to the CSU need to take into consideration the $583 million cut to the CSU was after the stimulus package. In fact, according to CSU numbers presented to the Board of Trustees twice in July of this year, the actual cut without the stimulus package would have been slightly over $1 billion. But when the governor did line item money to, earlier in the year, when he did line item money to the CSU, I thought it was 550, but whether 650, whatever it was, the assumption was that that was a one-time line item because the stimulus was going to refill it. And so in theory, that money's supposed to be in the budget next year. The one truly bleak piece of information is that in talking to people in Sacramento, no one really believes that the budget that we signed this week is accurate. Just as when the budget came out, the February budget was off by several $billions the day it was signed. This is really another smoke and mirrors budget. $16 billion worth of cuts, $9 billion worth of tricks, and it probably, I don't understand if you're doing $9 billion worth of tricks, well, you don't do $15 billion worth of tricks because we need about another $6 billion worth of tricks. So the situation, I do want to point out that the situation in Sacramento does not look promising for next year, but the initial promise is that that money's supposed to be back. Think of all the promises we've gone through on this budget alone since January of, when it was first proposed in January of 2008. And so Larry's point about the numbers for 2010-11 are being very fluid, I agree with, based on what I'm seeing. And what was sort of hinted by, even by the Chancellor as well as in Sacramento. But what I wanted to talk about briefly is that last week, as Larry pointed out, there was a town hall meeting for CSU EU and some of the other groups that had completed their implementation agreement on the furlough. As most of you know, the California Faculty Association did vote to accept the furlough vote about a week ago. And then we worked on a side letter, a memorandum of understanding on how that would be implemented, and it just was sent out. It was just completed Tuesday night and was sent out yesterday. I know a lot of people haven't seen it, and I want to give just a couple of highlights. I'm not going to read the whole thing, though I do want to read the preamble. That to preserve as many faculty unit jobs as possible and at the same time to serve as many students as possible without unreasonably increasing workload, while acknowledging that cuts of this magnitude will naturally have consequences for the quality of education we can provide. CFA and CSU hereby agree to the following memorandum of understanding. There's a clause about how much money we lost, but we all know that one. And B of the preamble is the purpose of furloughs is to lessen the severity of layoffs by reducing compensation costs. So we agreed to furlough recognizing it will reduce the quality of education this year and to lessen the severity of layoffs. So a couple of important points, I think, for not only the faculty but for the entire university, is that for the academic year faculty, which is the vast majority of the faculty, furloughs there will be 18 furlough days. They were talking 20, but it turned out the numbers that we were getting from CSU were somewhat distorted. And if we took 20 days off, our actual pay cut would be in excess of 11% rather than the 9.23 that other people are taking. So it'll be 18 furlough days. The president can designate up to 6 days a year as campus closure days, and those would be part of the furlough days. The other 12 furlough days would be based on faculty meeting and conferring with the appropriate administrator about furlough days. And absent mutual agreement, the appropriate administrator shall designate the furlough days based on compelling operational needs of the campus and shall explain those needs in writing to the faculty unit employee. So 1/3 of the furlough days will be if the president chooses to designate 6 days to close the campus for everybody, but the other 12 will be negotiated with the appropriate administrator. Additionally, there will be furlough days. It's predicated on the idea that we are to reduce our workload by 9.23%. This is not a pay cut in the sense of our hourly pay or having computed. It is a reduction in income and then an equal reduction in work. And in fact, the agreement has explicit things essentially ordering the CFA on their furlough days not to work for the California State University. For coaches, counselors, and librarians, because they have different work schedules, they will simply have a 8-hour reduction of work in the 40-hour period in which they are furloughing, so they would have essentially a day off. There's also, on probationary faculty will be allowed to request an additional year of probation prior to the first review. So if you are in a probationary, if you're working towards tenure and you see this additional burden of reduction in income and reduction in time harming that, you can simply opt out of the process for an additional year, and it is up to the faculty member to do that. It is not a mutually agreed to kind of thing. The other couple of points I wanted to make out is that FERPs can take an additional year leave of absence. They can take a leave of absence within the furlough this year and still retain your 5 total years of eligibility. So if you're in year 3 of your FERP and you decided to take this year off entirely, you would come back and still have retained your 3 years of FERP. Yeah, I just meant they can bail. I mean, they can take that time off. Also, there is new language for earning money over and above. Under the current contract, employees can, full-time faculty can work 125, a total of 125%. In other words, 25% over. Under the new agreement, you can either work basically 125% over your base hours, okay, or you can earn up to 125% of your base salary by doing additional work, which is an opportunity for those people who are hurt financially, can make up some of that, a substantial portion of that money by doing extra work, and they have more flexibility and more opportunities on that. We are having a meeting of the California Faculty Association at 1:15 after this meeting is over in Schultz 3001. We're actually talking more about what we're going to do, but I can go into more detail for members there, and I will answer any questions. This certainly is not everything in it, but the entire furlough agreement is online at calfac.org. Oh, and the last thing is Article 10 of the agreement says, and I will read all of that because it's pretty brief, any alleged violation of this MOU shall be grievable pursuant to the procedures of Article 10 of the collective bargaining agreement. So none of this, all of this is part of the regular contract from the standpoint of the rights of the faculty.
Thank you, Andy. Susan, could you maybe offer some comments?
Yeah, just a few things. Thank you, Andy, and thank you to everybody who's here today. These are traumatic times, and we need as much information as we can possibly get, and we need to find ways to work together to find pathways through. I would like to tell you, those of you who aren't on Senate Talk, that I've been trying to forward as much information as I get from listserv of statewide Senate chairs. All of us on all 23 campuses are struggling to find resolutions to the furlough issue and the budget cuts that we're experiencing, and each campus does it maybe a little differently. A few things that have come up this summer are decisions by the Chancellor's Office that there will be a restriction to second majors. When students achieve 120 units and have completed their major, they're going to be encouraged to graduate if not graduated, and that means that students who want to have minors or majors may be affected by that decision. So in your advising, you should keep this in mind and help our students to make as efficient progress towards their degree as they possibly can. Our Senate Budget Committee met yesterday, and there was discussion about what's called the marginal cost formula, which was used in times of growth to allocate resources to the various parts of the university. But in times of restriction, there often is a place at which you can no longer cut without cutting into the essential core. And so we hope there'll be discussion about changing that 38% that's used to allocate or restrict resources when it comes to courses for students, because most of us see our function here as teaching our classes for our students, and we want to do as much of that as we possibly can. There's a number of faculty who are hopeful that we can create, sort of on the run, new collaborative structures for finding responses to these cuts that seem to be coming faster than we can anticipate. And there's been a recommendation that we have a kind of emergency budget planning committee. I hope we can continue those discussions and come up with something and then find a way to communicate to all of you. I hope that if you have any creative responses, that you will be sure to let your faculty leaders, your senators, the Academic Senate Office, or me know, so that we can maintain this ongoing discussion. We're going to need to have as much communication as we can in the months to come, particularly for next spring and the following fall, when, absent any new taxes or budget resolutions at the statewide level, we're going to have an even bigger chore ahead of us. So I want to thank you all ahead of time for the sacrifices that you're making and that we're all going to make collectively.
Thank you, Susan. And last and certainly not least, Nick, any observations from a student perspective?
Thanks, Larry. And thank you all for coming. Maybe last, but I'll make it fast because I'm sure you have more questions than we have time for. But from the student perspective, I've gathered thus far, it's kind of not down to earth yet. The students who I think will react the most are still on summer vacation, and once they come back, the goal of the associated students is to make sure that they know this isn't going to be the same place, that we will be paying more, but we will be getting less. And my goal specifically is to inform as many people as I can about what's going on so that they can respond and not react to the situation. I think when something they've known for so long, if a junior or senior comes back to campus and a certain program or certain individual is not available as much as they have been, it's a real blow in the face. And to be able to know what's going on and why it's going on, will be able to, I think, calm their nerves and help them understand a little bit more. I just, in response to the feedback meeting this morning, I sent out a summary of what I learned to the school senators that hopefully they can pass on to the constituents within the department and educate as many people as they can. So with that said, the Associated Students is also taking a pretty big hit with the enrollment reduction in our student fees, which we're planning for currently. And we're internally making some changes to conform. So, thanks.
Thank you, Nick. Let's open it up for questions to any one of us of anything that we've said or that might be on your mind with respect to the numbers or the furloughs or whatever folks might have questions about. We have some microphones here, but the theater works pretty well, at least last week, for people just to raise their hand if you're uncomfortable in coming to the mic. Questions that we can help with. None.
No, there's
Probably.
one over there.
I'm
There's
sorry.
over here.
There we go. Yes, Catherine.
I've been addressed a lot of things in my life, but none is not one of them.
It's kind of hard to see with the lights. That's okay.
Two things. One, when is the bar opening for those of us who drink alcohol? Second, is Susan's suggestion about reconsidering the cuts based on the marginal cost or the distribution of the cuts for campus under serious consideration yet?
Well, I think for the 9-10 year, I think the general sense is we will use marginal cost. When you get out to 10-11, I think the numbers are still behind me, you can see that the vast majority of the reductions in 10-11 are not associated with enrollment. So I would fully expect that the cuts in 10-11 would not go on marginal cost, particularly the large number, the 3.2 million. I think that would go on some other basis. There is a retreat tomorrow, a cabinet retreat. It had been previously scheduled, but the idea there is to take a look at these numbers and their implications for the units. And not only do we have to take that into consideration, the impact of the marginal cost formula on what will happen to campus operations, but also what is the impact of every division. I mean, the divisions are restricted by what they can do in the area of personnel because of the furlough agreements and other agreements that have been reached with nearly every one of our bargaining units now. And we are at that place. I think it's fair to say, I think most of the managers and most of you would agree that reductions in operating expense are not really practical. I've reviewed some of the initial plans that folks have come forward, and I worry about the amount of operating expense they're even anticipating reducing. So when you get beyond that, you're into people. And when you're into people, we're not allowed to go to people, given where we stand. So the formulas, in many ways, become a little bit strange. No matter what formula we might use, I think where we are now is how will we, and this comes to Susan's point, regardless of the formulas, get through this year? I don't have a good answer for that. I don't think we know that. And so our traditional methods of thinking, I think, need to go out the window. All sorts of thoughts are being speculated on, but we have very, very little time. So I think these marginal cost formulas are just a beginning step. But the real issue is how will we function for the next 10 to 11 months? And how do we plan to function as we move forward into the 10-11 year? So I think the answer, that's a long roundabout way, says, yeah, probably it is. I don't know if we're going to be able to get there from here. I've seen some of the preliminary plans that folks have put together, and they know, I'm not sure that's going to work. And I do want to say there are a couple people that really need to be acknowledged. She's not here today. I think although I think you've been bringing her back from vacation inadvertently, that's Lori Heffernan. Lori and Melinda have done extraordinary work over the last week in Eduardo's absence. Eduardo was on a WASP visit, so he could not be here, and Melinda and Lori really have been extraordinary. Sandy Ratliff in Student Affairs, working with Matthew, just fantastic. Michelle, working in development with Patricia, and of course our own tremendous budget staff, Laura and Kathy and Janice. These folks have been working very, very hard under extraordinary pressure from Chancellors Office deadlines. So I do want to acknowledge their work. It's not been easy to figure out what we'll do in these very uncertain moments. I'm sure there's another question. Yeah.
So how will the enrollment reduction be translated into class cuts on the department level?
Eduardo, I think that would be.
Well, one of the things that was difficult about the Chancellor deadlines was that they were asking for bottom line numbers in terms of impact on a time frame that didn't make it possible for us to consult with schools and departments in the way that we would need to in order to provide accurate figures. So we have done our best at estimating it, and we have put some sort of bands around what we're going to do, but the actual work of implementing these reductions has yet to be done, and it will be done, is being done by the deans in consultation with department chairs. So inevitably, it means offering fewer classes. We have already taken some steps. I've directed the deans to cancel classes that are being offered below 60% capacity relative to the CS class code class size limit. Unless there are some compelling programmatic reasons why that shouldn't be done for any particular class. So the schools have been working on that with the department chairs, and we've had to, in fact, another complication we've had is we've had to sort of backtrack on the fall schedule to some extent, because if we left the fall schedule the way it was, we would have very little left to mount a spring schedule in terms of part-time instructional budget. So it's a challenge, but I can assure you that we will be doing this in consultation with the deans and the departments and the chairs, so that the actual impact on our programs will be developed from the grassroots up.
Eduardo, would you say a little bit about the contract courses, internships? I know there was an email that went out about those. Restricting those next year?
Can you remind me?
Well, I had heard, I think it was at the executive committee last week, that contract courses, internships, student assistantships will be by permission only of deans, and that they will be limited for next year because of the need to reduce enrollments. So.
Okay, yeah, that happened while I was gone. So.
Yeah.
I think Melinda knows the answer. Melinda?
Yeah.
They just want to make sure that we don't shift a low enrolled course over to an internship or a contract that still adds the burden onto another faculty member. So we're asking the deans to look very carefully that there are not extraordinary new contracts going out for internships as a result of the reduction in the low enrolled courses.
Other questions? Noel?
Yeah. And looking at the budgetary attached data tied to the expenditure plan, it appears that for parking services, police services, the costs that are budgeted are a little less than $1,200,000, but that the parking fees and tickets generate $1 million beyond that. To what extent are those costs of parking police services covered by that? It seems that there's another $1 million.
Yeah, there is a portion of the police force, and the police force is covered by the parking program on a reimbursed basis, because the police fulfill a parking enforcement function on behalf of the parking program, namely writing tickets. So they're already reimbursed, Noel, from that number. But I think your question is, could you not move perhaps more people that are not directly related to the parking program and put them on the parking program? I think that might be the question.
Actually, the question has to do with utilization of those fees that are generated by the tickets. So,
Okay, for the fees that are generated by the tickets themselves, we are required under the regulations of the state, I recall, I'm looking for Missy if she's here, to use them either for the administration of the program or for methods of alternate transportation. So we have traditionally used them to help pay for the parking enforcement officers, the creation of bike paths, the creation of bike racks, subsidies in the bus program, things of that nature. If you're talking about the fines and forfeitures themselves, they're restricted to alternate transportation. Is Missy here? I'm not seeing her.
No, she's not, Sally.
But Sally will know that.
That is correct. It cannot be put into personnel. And just like anything else, bodies are the majority of what takes up the budget, operating costs, and unfortunately those are restricted funds. But that is why if people see parking lots like G-Lot being repaid and do striping and they're saying, well, where are we coming up with that money? There is money in those revenues to do those kinds of maintenance things. We can't use it for bodies, and we can't fake it, speaking as a deputy chief, we can't fake it and say that the police officers are really doing a majority of the parking holes. That isn't their role. They are on the police side of the house, and that would be in Larry's areas. When audits come, it looks like you're trying to steal from categorical funds that can only be used for those other types of things.
I can say this, however, from the CFO's perspective, excuse me, from the system, CSU system, in these very peculiar times, these very odd times, we're raising questions in Long Beach about can some of these historical restrictions that Sally has spoken about be relaxed or modified or reduced to give us more flexibility in a variety of ways, not just in this particular fund, but in many funds. Many of them are embedded in either education code or actual legislation, so it makes it somewhat difficult. But we had a little discussion about that in the PBAC this morning, because some of those funds are a little bit more healthy than others, although I expect the excess earnings, if you will tend to be reduced as the enrollment falls. Barbara.
Larry and Eduardo, one of the things for those of us who've been here probably a bit longer is remembering that we've had a history of these kinds of budget crises. And in earlier times, we looked to some alternatives than just a straight percentage or the marginal cost formula to try to figure out how to deal with them, and particularly to try to figure out a way of funding classes for students, which is, I think, most of us would think a very primary part of our mission. And we look to auxiliaries, we look to other revenue-producing aspects that might be tapped appropriately, and I know some funds are restricted, but there are a number of things in the university for which we have fees that we pay, whether we're doing an installation of a computer or a door needs fixing. Is there anything in your thinking to kind of look outside of our current box to see if there are ways of reducing the impact on students? Because I think as we're going to come back, some of us are facing the fact that our traditional advising last semester didn't work for most of our students because we advised them knowing how the system worked. And now all the rules have changed. And we're going to have a lot of students having a really hard time making forward progress.
Yeah, I think it's a very good observation. And Barbie, you are right. You remember in the 90s, the mid-90s, the early 2000s, we pulled all sorts of creative angles out to try to mitigate. It's an interesting question we discussed in the forum last week on furlough, that you find yourself in this awkward place. The state has dealt an extraordinary blow to public education in California. They've taken a ton of money away from us, and if we make it look like, oh, business as usual, that's sort of a problem. On the other hand, it's in conflict with what most of us, I think, are in this business for, and that's helping students succeed with their goals. So I do think that over the next weeks, I mean, as Susan mentioned, these numbers have been hitting us and changing every week, different a little bit as the state's budget becomes clearer. Now that we kind of, I think, know, at least for 9-10, it's time for that creative thinking to happen. I think that's particularly going to be true with the extended education issue. I think it's going to be true with the endowment distribution issue. I think it's true with athletics. I think it's true with helping the divisions who are not going to be able to get there from here that quickly. So I suspect we'll come up with some angles that will be probably perceived as creative, and they tend to be sometimes controversial, but I think it calls for that at this time. The dilemma is, as you recall, Barbara, we've never had numbers like this. These numbers are just astounding. I mean, we've just never had them, so it's very, very difficult to get your head around them. But I do think we have to try to resolve them.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that. I've only been in Sonoma State for 6 years, but I've been in the CSU since 1981, and I have to agree with Chancellor Reed. This is the worst I have ever seen it, and by far. And And I think that we have to recognize that as a campus, as a small campus like that, we have very little ability to influence the global environmental trends in the state finances and in the economy. But one thing we can do is work to try to identify alternative sources of revenue. And so that's one area where we can control our destiny. And the two opportunities that have been pointed out by others are self-support programs and also non-resident students, which non-resident students that's both out of state, but especially international students. We are among the lowest 20% of the campuses in the CSU in terms of the proportion of international students in our student body. And they are, so there's room to grow in that sense and still be in the mainstream of what the CSU does. Currently, the non-resident students are not part of our FTS target and are not being funded at all. So they are entirely self-supporting based on the out-of-state fees that they're charged. So clearly, if we were to grow our international students by a huge amount, it would create a perception problem that we're doing this while cutting back on our domestic students. But beyond the perception, the reality is that bringing new out-of-state students does not in any way displace our local students because they're not part of our target. So they literally don't take any room there. And because they pay the out-of-state fee that is quite a bit higher and more than covers the cost of their instruction, actually are a net revenue source for the campus. And lastly, having more international students on our campus enriches the educational experience for all the students that we have here. So there are good pedagogical reasons for doing so. So that's one area that we could look for some relief. And then self-support programs too is another way that we can help leverage a little bit our human resources here and to generate more budget. And there's also been some talk. This is very speculative, just to show you the kind of thing that people are thinking about. Is there some way to relax some of the constraints we have now in terms of the firewall that's been built between self-support and state support programs to be able to assist the continued offerings of programs that are state-supported but that may be having difficulty with the current funding level in delivering the complete program on a timely basis.
Can I make a couple? Can I make
Absolutely.
Well, one thing, I certainly agree with Eduardo and others that this is a catastrophic time, much worse than any in the past. I don't necessarily agree with his prescription and clearly the Chancellor's prescription that there's not much we can do beyond our own campus. The Chancellor writes letters saying we can handle $410 million cuts and we wouldn't want to insult the legislature for asking for more. I don't believe that the California Faculty Association, I don't believe that the students, I don't believe that our colleagues in CSU and APC believe that we just have to sit and take it. I want to promote once again, we're having a meeting at 1:15 in Schultz 3001 to talk about that. We can do something. We do have 100,000 people signed up to try and help the CSU in budget crises. We want to get more people like that. So I do think that we need to recognize that we may be a small voice on this campus. And I'm not disputing that we have to think well on this campus, but I do think that there seems to be a certain passivity in Long Beach about these problems. The problems are real. I do not think, and I think that there's ample evidence that I could use but I don't have time, to demonstrate that I don't think that either the Board of Trustees or the Chancellor's Office served us particularly well in fighting for the CSU. And so the rest of us are going to have to kind of pick it up. And I think we really need to continue to realize that we are going to have to continue to be the trustees of our own system in that sense. So I would strongly promote that. And I do agree, at least on very much with Eduardo, about the idea that the international students would be very, very valuable for our own students because they will break a certain amount of provincialism that we have in California. But there are other issues about it, including perceptual ones. So I do think that I applaud that our colleagues are thinking thoughtfully, on all of us are thinking thoughtfully about how to deal with this. But I think that despite how horrible things are, they will get worse if we remain too passive. And I do think that the students have demonstrated they don't want to remain passive, and I hope that all the rest of us want to join the students in fighting for the CSU.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. We're coming up on the 1 o'clock. There's a person right up here, and then someone right here. And then there's, so we'll do 3 more questions. Yes, sir.
I'm very curious, what is the story on the high school? Do they pay rent to the campus? Because we can charge percentage per foot or usage of space. I'm curious how that works.
The tech high school? The tech high school has a 25-year lease agreement with the university that was negotiated some years ago, probably around 2000. And that lease agreement was in return for a $5 million contribution that the Toddy-Runner Park School District gave us to help with the construction of the Schultz Information Center. So they, in effect, prepaid the rent, if you will, and that's where that money goes. So they don't reimburse annually, since they've already reimbursed $5 million back 5 years ago. There was a question right here. Yes?
In terms of impacts for fall classes, classes are going to be cut in the fall. How soon will we know that, and how will students be notified?
Eduardo?
Yeah, we are going to be doing that before opening up second registration. And students are being notified by email via their departments. We're also planning to do a mass email to all of the students affected of a more generic kind, alerting them that their schedules have been impacted and that they need to look for some alternatives.
And a question right here.
I hate to end this on a truly negative note, but we've been talking a lot about reacting to the current situation, trying to figure out just how to mount the fall schedule. And it looks like this is going to have a bit of a snowball effect as these cuts are compounded one on top of the other over the next 2 semesters. Is there talk either CSU-wide or SSU-wide to create some sort of strategic plan to deal with a much smaller CSU? In other words, I know that the Provost has talked about duplication of programs and excess of programs. Clearly, if we get rid of all the part-timers in the first go-round, and then there's more cuts, that we will go beyond the part-timers. Is that going to be done across the board in a reactive way, or are there discussions about developing a strategy and priorities for downsizing the CSU and downsizing SSU?
I can speak to it a little bit administratively, and I'm sure Eduardo can do it academically. One of the things that we are doing, and this is a controversial concept, so I say it with some concern, but we are reflecting as business officers around the CSU about the way we've chosen to organize ourselves administratively. Is it necessary, for example, for there to be the same levels of business operations on every campus, or could those be consolidated into some regionalization or centralization? The reason it's controversial is that we've come to really value and enjoy the local control and local authority over our own destiny and over our own operations, and that's been an important value for the campus. But in the corporate world, which of course we're not corporate, there is the value that there can be cost savings achieved by centralization of administrative activities. This is also true in information technology. Does there need to be a data center on every campus, or could that be somehow regionalized and there be a Bay Area data center for the Bay Area campuses? It's controversial on many, many levels, but I think it comes to your point. As these reductions come to pass, we may have to rethink how the university operates. That's on the administrative side. Academically, Eduardo?
Yeah, well, I've been concerned about this since the first round of cuts that hit me when I joined Sonoma State. I use the phrase death by 1,000 cuts. This is the unkindest cut of all right now. And so we have to, I do believe that beyond this short-run response to just cope with the immediate need to make things balance in the short run, we have to reconfigure ourselves on some sort of a sustainable configuration. And that means looking at programs and streamlining and consolidating and focusing on the things that we will continue to be able to do adequately, even if our quality suffers, at least adequately, and not trying to do just as much as we were doing before with this dramatically reduced resource base. So absolutely, I expect we'll be doing that in this coming year.
Could I follow up with that very briefly? Some of us have been here a long time, and we've seen downturns, and we responded with creative collaborations between programs and sharing faculty. I think we need to remember that there are 60 to 100,000 students in California that are being turned away, that are still there, and they will continue to be there. Sometime we will grow. So while we may do accommodations now, I would hope that those could be creative and for the short term, looking at a longer term plan that could be sustainable, but that would not cut us back drastically and permanently at this point.
Bob?
I'm struck already by both you and Provost's remarks about autonomy of our campus and wanting to maintain it. But the striking thing here is that our departments do not have that autonomy to respond to this crisis. What is happening is that there's more centralization when that, in fact, on the tactical level, there should be more of setting targets that are clear to the department and leaving them to make the decision about the curriculum. What is happening is that these impositions are creating much more negative traffic than it's being productive. Could you speak to the possibility of giving us a monetary target and letting us, as a department, decide on how we want to deliver the curriculum, because we are the people who do it?
Well, we are in effect doing that with the schools. We have been operating.
Too large a level.
Well, then it has to be taken up at the school. But we are, in fact, even at the divisional level, though, there are some caveats. For example, across schools, and this is true across departments within schools, there are disparities in terms of how the levels of funding and the degree of cross-subsidization between upper and lower division classes. So there's a number of areas in which where a decentralized mode of operation, which can work reasonably well when you have a little bit of slack in the system. When the slack is eliminated and the cuts hit deeply the way they are now, you have to really look for the most efficient structure possible. And so you need to take, it requires a greater level of scrutiny and sort of optimization of how things are allocated. That's why, for example, what prompted me to issue this directive to cancel classes that fall below 60% capacity, because that's an area where we can achieve some additional efficiencies that would be difficult to achieve if this was simply left for every department to independently discover this particular strategy.
I think we're a little bit over our time, so I want to thank everyone for coming, and my colleagues on the panel, Nick and Andy, Susan, Eduardo, thank you for your participation, and see you all soon.